Sometimes the most
Thank you,
extraordinary
Lieutenant.
moments happen in the
This
most
briefing is
ordinary
critical.
places.
Pay close
Picture
attention.
this, a small coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, filled with the usual sounds of steaming milk, quiet conversations, and clinking cups. Behind the counter, a young woman in a simple apron goes through the motions she's done thousands of times before, taking orders, making drinks, wiping down tables. To every customer who walks through that door, she's just another college student working her way through school, invisible in the way service workers often become. But what if I told you that this ordinary woman carrying coffee trays had once soared through combat zones at supersonic speeds? What if those hands that now carefully crafted lattes had once gripped the controls of a fighter jet worth millions of dollars? What if the person asking, "Would you like extra foam?" had once been addressed only by her military call sign, commanding respect in rooms full of decorated officers? And what if, on this perfectly normal Tuesday, someone walked into that coffee shop who knew exactly who she really was? This is the story of how a single moment, the utterance of a forgotten call sign, shattered the careful barrier between two completely different lives. It's about the weight of secrets we carry, the sacrifices made in service to country, and the unexpected ways our past can catch up with us when we least expect it. Some stories begin with explosions or dramatic revelations. This one begins with the simple question, "Can I get a medium coffee black?" But by the time you reach the end, you'll understand how those 6 words changed everything, and why an entire room fell silent when they heard who was really standing behind that coffee counter. The morning rush at Brewer's Corner Cafe always started the same way. By 7:30, the line stretched nearly to the door, filled with sleepy commuters clutching their phones and checking watches, all desperate for their daily caffeine fix. Behind the counter, Sarah Martinez moved with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic after 18 months of the same routine. Steam hissed from the espresso machine, the register chimed with each transaction, and the familiar symphony of a busy coffee shop provided the backdrop to what appeared to be just another ordinary Tuesday. Sarah had perfected the art of blending in. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, her uniform apron hung loosely over plain clothes, and she wore the kind of comfortable shoes that could handle 8-hour shifts on concrete floors. To her regular customers, she was simply the friendly barista who remembered their orders and always had their drinks ready before they reached the counter. The businessman who wanted his double-shot cordial at exactly 7:45. The teacher who needed her vanilla latte with extra hot milk before facing 33rd graders. The construction worker who swore by black coffee so strong it could wake the dead. None of them knew that the woman making their morning coffee had once flown F-18 Super Hornets at speeds that would make their morning commute look like standing still. None of them realized that those steady hands that now carefully poured heart shapes in foam had once guided a $40 million aircraft through combat missions over hostile territory. To them, she was just Sarah, quiet, efficient, always polite, but never overly chatty. The transformation had been deliberate and complete. Gone were the perfectly pressed uniforms, the spit-shined boots, and the bearing that commanded immediate respect. Gone was the woman who had been known throughout the Navy as Phoenix, a call sign earned during her first deployment when she had managed to bring her damaged aircraft safely back to the carrier after taking enemy fire, rising from what should have been a fatal situation like the mythical bird itself. Captain Sarah Martinez, former Navy pilot, had become simply Sarah the barista, and she had worked hard to make sure those two identities never overlapped. She had chosen this small college town precisely because it was far from any military base, far from anyone who might recognize her face from commendation ceremonies or military publications. She had traded her officer's quarters for a tiny studio apartment above a bookstore, her flight suit for coffee shop uniforms, and her military salary for hourly wages that barely covered rent and groceries. The decision to leave hadn't been easy. Flying had been more than her job. It had been her identity, her passion, the thing that made her feel most alive. From the moment she had first climbed into the cockpit of a training aircraft at flight school, she had known she was exactly where she belonged. The rush of takeoff, the precision required for carrier landings, the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between mission success and failure. It had all felt like coming home. But that was before the incident. before the mission that had gone wrong despite perfect planning and flawless execution, before she had been forced to make a choice that saved lives but haunted her dreams, before the classified debriefings and the recommendation for psychological evaluation and the gentle but firm suggestion that perhaps it was time to consider other career options. The Navy had been willing to keep her. Her record was exemplary, her skills undeniable, and good pilots were always in demand. But Sarah had looked at herself in the mirror after that final mission and seen someone she didn't recognize. The confidence that had carried her through flight school and multiple deployments had been replaced by second-guessing. The steady hands that had never trembled in the cockpit now shook when she tried to sleep. The woman who had earned the call sign Phoenix because she could rise from any challenge now felt like she was barely keeping her head above water. So she had done what she thought was best for everyone. She had submitted her resignation, declined the Navy's offers of desk jobs and instructor positions, and walked away from the only life she had known since college. The ceremony had been small and private, a handful of fellow officers, a few perfunctory speeches, and the presentation of a flag and some medals that now sat in a box under her bed, gathering dust. Her family had been devastated. Her father, a retired Air Force colonel, couldn't understand why his daughter was throwing away such a promising career. Her mother worried constantly about Sarah living alone in a strange town, working a job that seemed beneath her education and abilities. Her younger brother, still in college and full of pride for his Navy pilot sister, stopped mentioning her occupation to his friends. But Sarah found something peaceful about the simplicity of her new life. There were no life-or-death decisions at the coffee shop. The most stressful moment of her day might be running out of oat milk during the morning rush or dealing with a customer upset about a wrong order. She could go entire days without thinking about flight patterns or weapons systems or the weight of responsibility that came with commanding a piece of military hardware worth more than most people's houses. She had built a quiet life, a safe life. She rented movies from the local video store, read novels in genres she had never had time for during her military career, and took long walks through the college campus without worrying about deployment schedules or training exercises. She made acquaintances among her coworkers and regular customers, but she was careful never to let anyone get close enough to ask probing questions about her past. The carefully constructed wall between her old life and new life had held for 18 months. She had perfected the art of deflecting personal questions with humor or by turning the conversation back to the other person. When people asked about her background, she had a practice story about dropping out of a graduate program and needing to figure out her next steps. When they commented on her unusual composure during busy rushes or her ability to stay calm when equipment broke down, she just shrugged and said she had always been good under pressure. But walls, even carefully built ones, can be broken by the most unexpected things. Sometimes it's a dramatic assault that brings them down. Sometimes it's just the right words spoken by the right person at exactly the wrong moment. This particular Tuesday had started like any other. Sarah had arrived at the shop at 6:30 to help with opening preparations. She had gone through her usual routine, checking inventory, setting up the espresso machine, arranging pastries in the display case. The early customers had been the usual crowd. Hospital workers grabbing coffee before their shifts, students pulling all-nighters who needed caffeine to make it through early classes, and the handful of early risers who preferred to get their coffee before the crowds arrived. By mid-morning, the initial rush had died down to a manageable pace. Sarah was working alone behind the counter, her manager having stepped out to handle a delivery. The shop had settled into its comfortable afternoon rhythm. A few customers scattered at tables, the soft murmur of conversation mixing with the background jazz that played over the sound system, and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine as Sarah prepared drinks for the steady trickle of customers. She was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door chimed, announcing another customer. She looked up with her practiced smile, ready to deliver her standard greeting, but the words died in her throat. Standing in the doorway was a man she hadn't seen in over 2 years, but who she would have recognized anywhere. Admiral James Richardson had aged since she had last seen him. His hair was grayer, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of the weight of command. But his bearing was unmistakable, the straight posture, The alert gaze that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings, the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. He wore civilian clothes, but they couldn't disguise his military background any more than her apron could disguise hers. For a moment, they stared at each other across the small coffee shop, the distance between them seeming both vast and insignificant. Sarah felt her carefully constructed new identity wavering like a mirage in the desert. All the months of practice, all the effort she had put into becoming someone new, suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper. The Admiral's expression was unreadable as he took in the scene. The woman he had once known as one of his most promising officers, now standing behind a coffee counter in a college town hundreds of miles from the nearest naval base. He approached the counter slowly, his footsteps echoing in what suddenly seemed like a much too quiet shop. Sarah found her voice first, falling back on her professional training even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" The Admiral studied her for a long moment before responding. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but carried the weight of their shared history. "Hello, Sarah. It's good to see you." The use of her real name felt strange after months of being just another anonymous service worker. But it was what he didn't say that made her hands tremble slightly as she reached for a cup. He didn't use her former rank. He didn't mention the Navy at all. He was giving her a choice: acknowledge their connection or maintain the fiction of her new identity. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked again, clinging to the familiar script of customer service like a lifeline. "Medium coffee, black," he said simply. Sarah nodded and turned to the coffee station, grateful for the excuse to look away from his penetrating gaze. As she poured the coffee, she was acutely aware of his presence behind her, of the way the normal sounds of the shop seemed muffled and distant. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, but her mind was racing. What was he doing here? This town was nowhere near any military installation, nowhere he would be for official business. Had he come looking for her specifically? How had he even known where to find her? She turned back to the counter and placed the coffee in front of him, their eyes meeting again. For a moment, she thought he was going to say something more, something that would shatter the careful silence they were maintaining. But instead, he simply placed exact change on the counter and picked up his coffee. "Thank you," he said formally. Then, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it, he added, "Take care of yourself, Captain." The use of her former rank hit her like a physical blow. For 18 months, no one had called her anything but Sarah, or Hey You, or Miss. The title felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like putting on clothes that no longer fit quite right. The Admiral turned and walked to a table in the corner, settling in with his coffee and what appeared to be a newspaper. But Sarah could feel his presence like a weight in the room. Every time she looked up from her work, she caught glimpses of him reading, occasionally glancing in her direction. The next hour passed in a strange, suspended animation. Other customers came and went, and Sarah served them with her usual efficiency, but part of her attention remained focused on the man in the corner. She found herself standing a little straighter, moving with some of the precision that had once been second nature. The military bearing she had worked so hard to suppress seemed to be reasserting itself despite her efforts to remain invisible. Finally, after what felt like hours but had probably been less than 90 minutes, the Admiral finished his coffee and stood to leave. He approached the counter once more, and Sarah braced herself for whatever he might say. "The coffee was excellent," he said formally. "Thank you for your service." The words had a double meaning that wasn't lost on either of them. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She watched him walk to the door, his figure silhouetted against the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Just before he pushed the door open, he turned back one last time. "You know," he said conversationally, "there's a veterans support group that meets at the community center on Thursday evenings. Sometimes it helps to talk to people who understand." And then he was gone, the bell chiming softly behind him, leaving Sarah alone with the lingering scent of black coffee and the weight of memories she had spent 18 months trying to forget. She stared at the empty doorway for a long moment, her carefully constructed walls feeling more fragile than ever. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. She went through the motions of serving customers and cleaning equipment, but Her mind kept returning to the Admiral's unexpected visit. By the time she finally locked up the shop that evening, she felt emotionally exhausted, as if she had been running on adrenaline for hours. Walking home to her small apartment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. For 18 months, she had successfully hidden from her past, convinced herself that she could simply be someone new. But seeing the Admiral had reminded her that some things couldn't be erased, no matter how hard you tried to start over. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the box of medals under her bed and the life she had walked away from. For the first time in months, she found herself wondering not just who she had been, but who she was supposed to become. The Thursday evening community center felt like neutral territory. Sarah had driven past the building 3 times before finally parking, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she tried to summon the courage to walk through those glass doors. The Admiral's suggestion had been playing in her mind for 2 days, competing with every instinct that told her to keep her past buried where it belonged. The support group met in a circle of folding chairs in a multi-purpose room that smelled of industrial carpet and coffee that had been sitting too long. When Sarah finally stepped inside, she found 12 other people already seated, ranging in age from early 20s to late 60s. Some wore clothing that hinted at their military background: Marine Corps t-shirts, Navy baseball caps, Army unit patches on jacket sleeves. Others, like herself, had dressed to blend in with the civilian world. The group leader, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patricia Wells, welcomed Sarah with the practiced ease of someone who had seen countless veterans take that first difficult step through the door. She didn't ask for details about Sarah's service record or push for personal information. Instead, she simply offered a chair and explained that newcomers were welcome to listen for as long as they needed before sharing anything. For the first few sessions, that's exactly what Sarah did. She sat quietly in her folding chair, listening to stories that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. There was Marcus, a former Army medic who couldn't handle the sight of blood anymore and had panic attacks every time he heard ambulance sirens. There was Jennifer, a Marine who had done 3 tours in Afghanistan and now found herself unable to sleep in complete darkness. There was David, a Navy sonar operator whose hearing had been damaged by years of submarine service and who struggled with the isolation of his partial deafness. Each person's story was different, but Sarah recognized the common thread that ran through all of them: the challenge of translating military identity into civilian life, the weight of experiences that couldn't be easily explained to people who had never served, and the strange loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who couldn't understand the most formative experiences of your life. During her 3rd session, Dr. Wells gently asked if Sarah would like to share her name and branch of service. The room fell quiet, waiting without pressure, and Sarah found herself speaking almost without conscious decision. "I'm Sarah," she said quietly. "I was a Navy pilot." That simple statement opened something inside her that she hadn't realized had been sealed shut. Over the following weeks, she began to share fragments of her story. Not the classified details, not the specific missions or locations, but the emotional weight of it all. The pride she had felt the first time she successfully landed on a carrier deck. The camaraderie of her squadron. The responsibility of flying missions where other people's lives depended on her skill and judgment. The group listened without judgment, understanding in ways that her civilian co-workers never could. They understood why she sometimes stood at attention when she heard the national anthem playing over the radio at work. They understood why sudden loud noises made her tense up, and why she unconsciously scanned exits and potential threats even in the safety of the coffee shop. They understood the strange guilt of walking away from something that had been so central to her identity. It was during her 6th session that Sarah finally found the courage to talk about the incident that had ended her career. Dr. Wells had been discussing moral injury, the psychological wound that could occur when someone was forced to make decisions that conflicted with their deeply held beliefs about right and wrong, even when those decisions were legally and tactically correct. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't what we did wrong," Dr. Wells explained to the group. "Sometimes it's the burden of having done everything right, but still carrying the weight of the consequences." Sarah felt those words settle into her chest like a key turning in a lock she had been afraid to open. For the first time in 2 years, she found herself speaking about the mission that had changed everything. It had been a routine escort mission, she told the group. Intelligence had identified a convoy of trucks moving through a mountain pass that was believed to be carrying weapons to insurgent groups. Her squadron's job was to provide air support for ground forces who would intercept and search the convoy. Standard procedure, the kind of mission she had flown dozens of times before. But intelligence had been wrong. The convoy wasn't carrying weapons. It was carrying medical supplies to a remote village clinic, driven by local civilians who had no connection to any insurgent activity. By the time this became clear, the ground forces had already engaged, and the situation had escalated beyond anyone's control. Sarah's voice became steadier as she continued, falling into the clipped, professional tone she had once used for mission debriefings. She described the chaos of the radio communications, the confusion as conflicting orders came through multiple channels, and the split-second decision she had been forced to make when one of the trucks had broken away from the convoy and was speeding toward a village where ground forces were positioned. The rules of engagement had been clear. An unidentified vehicle moving at high speed toward friendly forces in a combat zone could be considered a threat. She had been authorized to engage. Her training, her experience, and every protocol she had been taught told her to fire. But something had made her hesitate. Maybe it was the way the truck was moving, erratically, like a panicked civilian rather than a tactical assault. Maybe it was the voice of the ground team leader, who had sounded uncertain when he requested air support. Maybe it was just instinct. Instead of firing, she had broken protocol and flown low over the truck, close enough to see through the windshield. Close enough to see the terrified face of a teenage boy behind the wheel, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel as he desperately tried to get away from the gunfire behind him. Close enough to realize that he wasn't attacking anyone. He was running for his life. She had immediately radioed the ground forces, identifying the driver as a non-combatant and ordering them to hold their fire. The boy had safely reached the village, and the entire convoy had eventually been secured without casualties on either side. The mission had been deemed a complete success, and Sarah had been commended for her restraint and judgment under pressure. But that success had come at a cost she hadn't anticipated. In the weeks following the mission, she found herself lying awake at night, not celebrating her good decision, but thinking about all the times she hadn't hesitated. All the times she had followed protocols and rules of engagement without that moment of doubt. All the split-second decisions she had made throughout her career based on incomplete information and training that prepared you for combat, but couldn't account for every variable. She had never harmed an innocent person. Her record was clean, her conscience technically clear. But the weight of possibility, the knowledge of what could have happened if she hadn't looked closer, if she hadn't trusted that moment of instinct over her training, had settled into her bones like a permanent ache. I started second-guessing everything, she told the group, her voice barely above a whisper. Every decision, every judgment call. I couldn't trust myself anymore, and when you're flying a fighter jet, that kind of doubt can get people killed. The room was completely silent when she finished. Sarah stared at her hands, feeling emotionally drained but also oddly relieved. She had never told anyone the complete story before, not the Navy psychiatrists, not her family, not even herself in the privacy of her own thoughts. Dr. Wells spoke first, her voice gentle but firm. You made the right decision, Sarah. You saved a life. But what about all the times I didn't look closer? Sarah asked, the question that had been haunting her for 2 years finally spoken aloud. What about all the decisions I made without that moment of doubt? How do I know I was always right? You don't, said Marcus, the former medic. None of us do. That's part of what we carry. Jennifer, the Marine, nodded slowly. I used to think that military training was about learning to make perfect decisions under pressure. But really, it's about learning to live with the decisions you make, even when you can't be sure they were perfect. Over the following sessions, Sarah began to understand that her guilt wasn't really about the decisions she had made. It was about the impossible standard she had set for herself, the belief that she could and should be able to control every variable, predict every outcome, and carry the weight of absolute certainty in situations where certainty was impossible. The group helped her see that her decision to leave the Navy, while understandable, had been based on a false choice. She had believed that the only options were perfect confidence or complete withdrawal. But there was a third possibility she had never considered: learning to act with wisdom and integrity while accepting the fundamental uncertainty of life. Courage isn't the absence of doubt, Dr. Wells explained during one particularly powerful session. Courage is acting with integrity despite doubt. And wisdom is learning to live with the weight of responsibility without letting it crush you. Meanwhile, life at the coffee shop continued its predictable rhythm. But something had shifted in how Sarah approached her work. She still made drinks with the same efficiency and served customers with the same politeness. But she found herself paying closer attention to the people around her. The businessman who came in every morning wasn't just another regular customer. He was someone carrying his own invisible weight, his own daily challenges. The college student who spent hours at a corner table wasn't just taking up space. She was someone working multiple jobs to pay for school, someone whose determined focus reminded Sarah of her younger self. Sarah began to see her job not as a hiding place from her real life, but as a different kind of service. She started remembering names more deliberately, asking about tests and job interviews she knew were coming up, checking in on customers who looked like they were having difficult days. It wasn't therapy or counseling, just the simple human connection that came from paying attention and caring about the people around her. One afternoon, about 2 months after she had started attending the support group, a customer she had never seen before came into the shop. He was young, probably early 20s, with the bearing and haircut that immediately identified him as military. He ordered coffee with the polite formality she recognized from her own early days in service, and she noticed the way his eyes automatically cataloged exits and potential threats, habits that would probably never fully leave him. As she handed him his coffee, she took a chance. First time away from base in a while. He looked startled, then defensive. "What makes you think I'm military?" Sarah smiled, recognizing herself in his automatic deflection. "Just a guess. There's a veterans group that meets at the community center on Thursday evenings, if you're interested. Sometimes it helps to talk to people who get it." She said it casually, the same way the Admiral had mentioned it to her, without pressure or expectation. The young man nodded noncommittally and left, and Sarah didn't expect to see him again. But he came back the following week, and the week after that. And, eventually, on a Thursday evening, Sarah was surprised to see him walk into the community center meeting room, looking exactly as uncertain and determined as she had felt months earlier. Watching him take that first difficult step reminded Sarah how far she had come. She was still working at the coffee shop, still living in her small apartment, still wrestling with questions about her identity and her future. But she was no longer hiding from her past or pretending to be someone she wasn't. The medals in the box under her bed were still there, still gathering dust. But now they felt less like reminders of a life she had abandoned, and more like artifacts of a journey that had led her to exactly where she needed to be. She didn't know what came next, whether she would stay in the coffee shop indefinitely, whether she would eventually find a way to use her military training in civilian life, whether she would ever feel ready to fly again. What she did know was that she was no longer afraid of the answer. The woman who had been Captain Sarah Martinez, call sign Phoenix, and the woman who was Sarah the barista weren't two separate people trying to hide from each other. They were the same person, shaped by all of her experiences, learning to integrate the different aspects of her identity into something new and authentic. The Admiral never came back to the coffee shop, but Sarah found herself grateful for his unexpected visit. He had reminded her that some parts of yourself can't be hidden, even when you think they've been successfully buried. But, more importantly, he had shown her that acknowledging those parts didn't have to be a defeat. It could be the beginning of something different, and potentially better. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah began to think about the future differently. Not as something to be afraid of, but as something to be curious about. The support group had taught her that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on. It was about learning to carry your experiences with wisdom rather than burden. She still didn't know what direction her life would take. But, for the first time in 2 years, she was looking forward to finding out. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, during the quiet lull between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd. Sarah was restocking the pastry display when her manager, Tom, approached with the phone in his hand and an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sarah, there's someone on the phone asking for you. Says it's official business." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she took the phone. Very few people knew where she worked, and even fewer would describe their reason for calling as official business. Her first thought was that something had happened to a family member, but the voice that greeted her was unfamiliar and distinctly professional. "Ms. Martinez? This is Commander Lisa Park from Naval Air Station Jacksonville. I'm calling on behalf of Admiral Richardson. He asked me to contact you regarding a matter of some urgency." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. She hadn't spoken to Admiral Richardson since his unexpected visit to the coffee shop 6 months earlier, and she couldn't imagine why he would be contacting her now through official channels. "What kind of matter?" she asked carefully. "Ma'am, I'm not at liberty to discuss the details over an unsecured line. The Admiral has requested a meeting with you at your earliest convenience. We can arrange transportation if necessary." Sarah felt the familiar weight of military protocol settling around her like an old coat. The careful language, the implications of security concerns, the assumption that she would simply drop everything and comply with the Admiral's request. It was all achingly familiar and completely at odds with the civilian life she had built. "I appreciate the call, Commander, but I'm no longer in the Navy. I'm not sure what the Admiral thinks I can help with." There was a brief pause before Commander Park replied, and Sarah could hear the careful diplomacy in her voice. "Ma'am, the Admiral specifically requested that I tell you this involves the incident with Phoenix Squadron and Operation Bright Star. He said you would understand the significance." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Operation Bright Star was classified at levels that required special clearance even to acknowledge its existence. The fact that Admiral Richardson was referencing it openly meant that something significant had happened, something that required immediate attention from someone with her specific knowledge and experience. She closed her eyes, feeling the carefully constructed walls of her civilian life beginning to crack. "When does he need to see me?" "Today, if possible, ma'am. I have a car standing by, and we can have you at Jacksonville within 3 hours." Sarah looked around the coffee shop, at Tom, who was pretending not to listen while obviously hanging on every word, at the regular customers who knew her only as the friendly barista who remembered their orders, at the simple life she had built that suddenly felt as fragile as morning mist. "I'll need to make arrangements here. Can you give me an hour?" "Of course, ma'am. The driver will be at your location at noon." After she hung up the phone, Sarah stood motionless for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Tom approached cautiously, his expression concerned. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah almost laughed at the accuracy of his observation. "I need to take some personal time. Family emergency. I'm not sure when I'll be back." It wasn't exactly a lie. The military had been her family for 15 years, and if Admiral Richardson was calling her back to discuss Operation Bright Star, it definitely qualified as an emergency. Tom nodded without question. He had always been a good manager, understanding that his employees had lives outside the coffee shop that sometimes required immediate attention. "Take whatever time you need. We'll cover your shifts." The next hour passed in a blur of automatic actions. Sarah went home to her apartment and changed into the closest thing she owned to professional civilian attire, a navy blue suit she had bought for job interviews that she rarely had occasion to wear. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone caught between identities, neither fully military nor completely civilian. The car that arrived at noon was an unmarked sedan with government plates, and a driver who introduced himself simply as Petty Officer Johnson. He was polite, but not chatty, and Sarah was grateful for the silence as they drove through the familiar landscape of northern Florida toward the Naval Air Station. As they approached Jacksonville, Sarah felt memories flooding back with unexpected intensity. The sight of aircraft in the distance, the sound of jet engines, the distinctive smell of aviation fuel, it all combined to transport her back to a time when this environment had been as natural as breathing. Her hands, which had been steady enough for the most delicate coffee preparations, began to tremble slightly. Naval Air Station Jacksonville looked exactly as she remembered it. The security checkpoints, the rows of aircraft gleaming in the afternoon sun, the purposeful movement of personnel going about their duties. It was like stepping back in time. But there were differences too. New construction, updated equipment, faces she didn't recognize among the sailors, and officers moving around the base. The driver escorted her to the administration building and up to the Admiral's office. Commander Park met them at the door, a professional woman in her 40s who greeted Sarah with the kind of respectful courtesy reserved for former officers, even those who had left under difficult circumstances. "Captain Martinez, thank you for coming on such short notice." The use of her former rank felt strange, but not unwelcome. Sarah nodded acknowledgement as she was led into Admiral Richardson's office, a space that managed to be both impressive and functional, with windows overlooking the flight line where F-18s were lined up in precise formation. Admiral Richardson stood as she entered, and Sarah automatically found herself standing at attention before catching herself and forcing her posture to relax. The Admiral noticed the momentary lapse and smiled slightly. "At ease, Captain, and thank you for coming. Please have a seat." As Sarah settled into the chair across from his desk, Admiral Richardson studied her with the same penetrating gaze she remembered from their encounter at the coffee shop. But this time, his expression was grave in a way that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. "I imagine you're wondering why I called you here," he began without preamble. "The answer is both simple and complicated. We need your help." Sarah waited, knowing better than to interrupt when a senior officer was building up to something important. 3 weeks ago, the Admiral continued, "we lost contact with a reconnaissance aircraft operating in international waters off the South China Sea. The plane was conducting routine surveillance as part of Operation Bright Star's ongoing monitoring protocols." Sarah felt her breath catch. Operation Bright Star had been her final assignment, a classified mission that involved tracking military movements in sensitive regions. The reconnaissance flights were considered routine but carried enormous strategic importance, gathering intelligence that informed decisions at the highest levels of government. The aircraft was an EP-3 with a crew of 6, Admiral Richardson continued. Initial reports suggested possible mechanical failure, but subsequent investigation revealed something more troubling. The plane didn't crash. It was forced down by hostile aircraft and is currently being held at an undisclosed location. The implications hit Sarah immediately. An EP-3 reconnaissance plane contained classified equipment and intelligence-gathering capabilities that could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. More importantly, 6 American service members were being held hostage, their lives dependent on decisions being made in rooms like this one. "The situation is complicated by several factors," the Admiral explained. "First, the crew is being held in a location that makes traditional military rescue operations extremely difficult. Second, the political climate makes overt action problematic. Third, and most relevant to why you're here, the hostage-takers have made specific demands regarding the personnel involved in any negotiation or rescue attempt." Sarah leaned forward despite herself. "What kind of demands?" "They want to deal only with military personnel who were directly involved in Operation Bright Star. Specifically, they've requested the pilot known by the call sign Phoenix." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the solar plexus. For 2 years, she had been trying to leave Phoenix behind, to build a new identity separate from her military past. Now that past was reaching out to drag her back into exactly the kind of high-stakes situation she had walked away from. "Admiral," she said carefully, "I'm no longer qualified for active duty. I've been out of the military for 2 years. I haven't maintained my flight certifications, my security clearances have probably lapsed, and I'm not in the mental space to handle this kind of operation." Admiral Richardson nodded, as if he had expected this response. "I understand your concerns, Captain, but the situation is not quite what you might think. We're not asking you to pilot a rescue mission or engage in combat operations. What we need is someone with your specific knowledge of Operation Bright Star protocols and your unique psychological profile." He leaned forward, his expression intensely serious. "The intelligence we've gathered suggests that the hostage-takers are not typical terrorists or enemy combatants. They're former military personnel themselves, with extensive knowledge of American tactics and protocols. They specifically requested Phoenix because they believe she represents a certain kind of military thinking, someone who prioritizes preservation of life over strict adherence to protocol." Sarah felt a chill as she realized what he was implying. They know about the incident with the convoy. They know about your decision to verify the target before engaging. Yes, that incident was classified, but certain details have apparently leaked through intelligence networks. They see you as someone they can negotiate with, someone who understands the value of restraint. The irony was almost overwhelming. The decision that had ended her military career because it filled her with doubt about her judgment was now being cited as the reason she was uniquely qualified for this mission. What exactly are you asking me to do? Admiral Richardson activated a secure display screen that showed a map of the South China Sea with various markers and coordinates. We believe the crew is being held on a small island approximately 200 miles southeast of Hainan. The area is heavily monitored by Chinese coastal forces, making conventional military approach impossible without triggering a larger international incident. He highlighted a specific location on the map. The hostage-takers have agreed to negotiate, but only through secure radio contact with Phoenix. They want to discuss terms for releasing the crew and returning the aircraft, but they refuse to deal with anyone else. Sarah studied the map, her military training automatically assessing the tactical situation even as part of her mind recoiled from the implications. And if these negotiations fail, then we proceed to more direct options, which carry significantly higher risks for everyone involved: the hostages, the rescue teams, and potentially international stability in the region. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a familiar burden. 6 lives hung in the balance, and somehow her unique combination of knowledge, experience, and psychological profile made her the best hope for bringing them home safely. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation she had tried to escape by leaving the military. But as she sat in that office, looking at the tactical displays and feeling the familiar adrenaline of operational planning beginning to flow through her veins, Sarah realized something important. She hadn't walked away from the military because she couldn't handle the responsibility. She had walked away because she was afraid of making the wrong decision under pressure. Now she was being asked to make exactly those kinds of decisions again, but with one crucial difference. This time, the hostage-takers had specifically chosen her because of her willingness to look beyond protocol and training to make decisions based on human considerations. They weren't asking for the perfect military machine she had tried to become. They were asking for the person who had hesitated to fire at a panicked teenager, who had chosen to verify rather than engage. "When do the negotiations begin?" she asked. Admiral Richardson's expression showed a mixture of relief and concern. "Tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. You'll be working with a full intelligence team, and we'll have psychological specialists available to help prepare you for what might be a very complex conversation." Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar transformation beginning. The barista who made coffee and worried about running out of oat milk was fading, replaced by Captain Martinez, call sign Phoenix, who had once been trusted with multi-million-dollar aircraft and life-or-death decisions. But this time, she wasn't trying to suppress one identity in favor of the other. Instead, she was beginning to understand how both versions of herself could contribute to the task ahead. The empathy and human connection she had learned to value during her time at the coffee shop weren't weaknesses to be overcome. They were tools that might prove essential to bringing those 6 crew members home alive. "Admiral," she said, standing and falling naturally back into military bearing, "I'll need quarters for tonight, and a full briefing on everything we know about the hostage-takers and their motivations. And I'll need secure communication with the support group I've been attending. They're going to worry if I disappear without explanation." Admiral Richardson smiled, recognizing something in her demeanor that had been missing during their encounter at the coffee shop. "Welcome back, Phoenix." As Sarah left the Admiral's office to begin preparations for what might be the most important conversation of her life, she realized that she wasn't really coming back to her old life. Instead, she was finally ready to integrate all the parts of herself into something new. Someone who could carry the precision and courage of military training alongside the empathy and human understanding she had learned to value in civilian life. The next 24 hours would test everything she had learned about herself over the past 2 years. But for the first time since she had left the Navy, Sarah felt ready for the challenge. The Secure Communication Center at Naval Air Station Jacksonville hummed with quiet intensity at 0745 hours the next morning. Sarah sat before a bank of monitors and communication equipment that would have looked futuristic just a few years earlier, but now represented the standard tools of modern military operations. Around her, a carefully selected team of specialists monitored every aspect of the upcoming negotiation: signal analysts, psychological warfare experts, intelligence officers, and communication technicians. Admiral Richardson occupied a position where he could observe without interfering, understanding that this conversation needed to be between Phoenix and the hostage-takers without the obvious presence of senior command authority. Dr. Patricia Wells, Sarah's therapist from the Veterans Support Group, sat at a nearby station. Her presence had been Admiral Richardson's idea, a recognition that this operation required not just military expertise, but also understanding of the psychological complexities involved. Sarah wore a communications headset that would allow her to speak directly with the hostage-takers while simultaneously receiving input from her support team through a secondary channel. She had spent the previous evening reviewing intelligence files, studying psychological profiles of the suspected hostage-takers, and preparing for conversations that could go in any number of directions. The intelligence picture was complex and troubling. The hostage-takers appeared to be led by Colonel Chen Wei, a former pilot in the People's Liberation Army Air Force who had defected to Taiwan several years earlier before disappearing entirely from official records. Chen had extensive knowledge of both Chinese and American military protocols, making him uniquely dangerous as an adversary. His psychological profile suggested someone driven by a complex mixture of ideological conviction and personal trauma related to his military service. What made the situation even more delicate was Chen's apparent knowledge of Sarah's own military record. Intelligence suggested that he had specifically requested Phoenix not because of her tactical skills, but because he identified with her decision to question protocol in the service of preserving life. In his mind, she represented a kind of military thinking that prioritized human considerations over abstract strategic objectives. At exactly 0800 hours, the primary communication array activated, and Sarah heard the crisp voice of a radio operator speaking accented but perfect English. American Naval Station, this is Island Base requesting communication with pilot call sign Phoenix. Confirm Phoenix is present and ready for negotiation. Sarah looked around the room, noting the tense expressions of everyone present. 6 American lives depended on the next few hours, and she was the primary point of contact. She took a deep breath and activated her microphone. Island Base, this is Phoenix. I'm here and ready to talk. There was a brief pause before a new voice came through the speakers. Older, more authoritative, with the unmistakable tone of command experience. Phoenix, I am Colonel Chen Wei. I thank you for agreeing to this conversation. I trust you understand the delicate nature of our situation. Sarah had practiced this moment dozens of times during the previous evening, but hearing Chen's actual voice added a human dimension that training couldn't replicate. This wasn't a theoretical exercise or a simulation. They will remain so as long as our discussions proceed constructively. What are your terms for their release? But that assumes I wish to negotiate their release in the traditional sense. Tell me, Phoenix, what do you know about my background? Sarah glanced at the intelligence briefing materials spread before her. I know you were a pilot in the People's Liberation Army Air Force. I know you defected to Taiwan and subsequently disappeared from official records. Beyond that, I know you've specifically requested this conversation with me. All accurate, though incomplete. Do you know why I defected, Phoenix? This was not the direction Sarah had expected the conversation to take. According to the psychological briefing, Chen was likely to begin with specific demands, prisoner exchanges, political concessions, or financial considerations. Instead, he seemed interested in establishing a personal connection. I assume you had ideological differences with your superiors, Sarah replied carefully. Ideological differences, Chen repeated thoughtfully. A diplomatic way to phrase it. The truth is more complex. Tell me, Phoenix, have you ever been ordered to do something that you knew was wrong, but which followed all proper protocols and procedures? Sarah felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly the kind of psychological territory that Dr. Wells had warned her about, an attempt to create common ground based on shared experiences of moral conflict in military service. Colonel, I think we should focus on the immediate situation. Your crew is undoubtedly worried about their families, and my government is concerned about their safety. What can we do to resolve this quickly and peacefully? You're deflecting, Phoenix. That's understandable, but not helpful. I requested you specifically because I believe you understand something that most military personnel do not, that sometimes the right decision and the officially correct decision are not the same thing. Sarah looked at Dr. Wells, who nodded slightly, a signal that engaging with Chin's psychological approach might be more productive than trying to steer him toward traditional negotiation frameworks. Colonel, you're right that military service sometimes presents difficult moral choices. I assume you're referring to my decision to verify a target before engaging during Operation Bright Star. Exactly. You chose to look closer when protocol suggested you should fire immediately. You prioritized human life over tactical efficiency. That decision ended your career, did it not? The accuracy of his intelligence was unsettling, but Sarah forced herself to remain focused. That's correct. But I'm not sure how that relates to the current situation. It relates because I made a similar choice, Phoenix. I was ordered to engage civilian aircraft that had strayed into restricted airspace. The aircraft was clearly marked as medical transport, carrying injured children from a rural area to a hospital in a major city. But it had violated airspace restrictions, and my orders were clear. Any unauthorized aircraft was to be considered hostile and engaged immediately. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she began to understand where this conversation was leading. Chun continued, his voice heavy with old pain. I followed protocol, Phoenix. I engaged the aircraft as ordered. It was carrying 12 children under the age of 10, along with medical personnel trying to save their lives. I killed them all because I followed orders, because I trusted the system instead of trusting my judgment. The communication center fell completely silent. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat as she processed what Chun had just told her. He had made the opposite choice from the one she had made, followed protocol instead of questioning it, and the consequences had destroyed his ability to live with himself. I'm sorry, Colonel, she said finally, meaning it sincerely. That must have been incredibly difficult to live with. It was impossible to live with, Phoenix. That's why I defected. But defection brought its own problems. The Taiwanese intelligence services wanted to use me for propaganda purposes to make public statements about Chinese military brutality. They wanted me to become a symbol of their resistance to mainland authority. But I wasn't interested in becoming anyone's propaganda tool. I just wanted to find a way to prevent other pilots from being put in the same impossible situation. Sarah began to see the outline of what Chun was really after. This wasn't about prisoner exchanges or political concessions. This was about trying to create some kind of meaningful change in how military personnel were trained to handle moral conflicts. What do you want from me, Colonel? I want you to understand something, Phoenix. The crew we're holding, they're not prisoners in the traditional sense. They're participants in a demonstration. We've treated them well, given them comfortable quarters, allowed them to communicate with their families through secured channels. But we're using their situation to make a point about the nature of military decision-making. What kind of point? The American and Chinese militaries train their personnel to follow orders without question, to trust in the wisdom of their superiors and the correctness of established protocols. But protocols are created by people who aren't present when critical decisions must be made. Protocols can't account for the specific human factors that exist in every real-world situation. Chen paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a tone of urgent conviction. You and I, Phoenix, we represent a different kind of military thinking. We've both been willing to question protocol when human lives were at stake. We've both paid a price for that willingness. But, perhaps together, we can demonstrate that there's value in training military personnel to think critically about their orders, not just follow them blindly. Sarah felt the weight of his proposition settling around her. Are you suggesting some kind of joint statement? A public demonstration of alternative military philosophy? I'm suggesting something more concrete, Phoenix. I want you to join me here, voluntarily, for a period of 1 week. During that time, we'll work together with the captured crew to develop new protocols for handling situations where moral judgment and military orders come into conflict. At the end of the week, all personnel, including you, will be released unharmed, along with a public document outlining our recommendations for military reform. The audacity of the proposal was breathtaking. Chen wasn't just holding hostages. He was trying to recruit Sarah as a collaborator in what amounted to an elaborate military philosophy experiment. Sarah looked around the communications center, noting the mix of shock and concern on the faces around her. Admiral Richardson was already shaking his head slightly, a clear signal that accepting such a proposal was absolutely out of the question. "Colonel," Sarah said carefully, "you're asking me to voluntarily become a hostage in order to participate in what amounts to a critique of American military training. You understand that's not something I can agree to." "I understand it's not something your superiors would want you to agree to," Chen replied. "But I'm not asking your superiors, Phoenix. I'm asking you, as one pilot to another, as one person who understands the weight of moral decision-making to another." Sarah felt the familiar pressure of impossible choices settling around her. Chen's proposal was clearly unacceptable from a military standpoint. It would set a precedent for hostage-taking as a means of political expression, and it would put her own life at risk for uncertain gain. But she could also hear the genuine conviction in his voice, the pain of someone who had been carrying the weight of a terrible decision for years and was desperately trying to find some way to prevent others from facing the same impossible choices. "Colonel, I appreciate what you're trying to accomplish, but I can't agree to your proposal. However, I'm willing to continue." Your own experience demonstrates that there's value in the latter approach, even when it comes at personal cost. As the communication ended and the room began to buzz with activity, Sarah realized that she had just committed herself to something that might be even more challenging than accepting Chen's original proposal. For the next week, she would need to find a way to engage seriously. Each morning at 0800 hours, she returned to the communication center for another session with Colonel Chun, and each conversation revealed new layers of complexity in both his motivations and her own understanding of military service. Chun proved to be intelligent, articulate, and deeply committed to his vision of military reform. During their second session, he presented detailed proposals for incorporating moral reasoning training into military education. During their third, he outlined specific protocols for situations where following orders might conflict with ethical considerations. His ideas weren't the ravings of an unstable defector. They were thoughtful, well-researched suggestions that